science is there to advance societies and the human race for betterment, right? And so one traditional way that, we all see is the academic setting where, researchers sit in their labs, they generate evidence, and then, it goes into the publication field where it, enhances scientific knowledge. And sometimes, if we are lucky, it moves more into the discovery and innovation space, which is one way of impacting lives positively. But the other critical piece, and I'd say, the most critical and one of the low-hanging fruits, if that's a phrase we can use, is that when science or evidence or data is used to go into policy, it immediately can start impacting people's lives and societies for the positive. So it's actually a vehicle or a means of delivering, right, what science is meant to for society.
Welcome back to Africa Science Focus, the weekly science and development show from SciDevNet. I'm Ogechi Kianyao. You are just listening to Uzma Alam, Program Lead for Science Policy Engagement at the Science for Africa Foundation. She spoke about the crucial link between science and policy. In this episode, we'll be discussing the importance of science advice in policy making. Our reporter, Michael Kaluki, will be speaking to top scientists in sub-Saharan Africa on how governments and scientists in the region can collaborate effectively to create beneficial policies. Dr. Shahin Mutala Timo, the chair of the African chapter of the International Network for Governmental Science Advice, and the head of academic and quality enhancement at Middlesex University in Mauritius, explains science policies to us.
A policy is a formal statement or a set of guidelines that is established by an organization, a government, an institution that guide decision-making and action in specific area. So in essence, a policy outlines what the problem is, or what the potential problem is, what should be done by whom, how it should be done, and under what circumstances. It gives everyone involved direction on how to achieve the goals and vision of a country or an organization. So policies may be developed for specific audiences or for national purposes. And policies usually emerge to meet the evolving needs and demands of society. And in my opinion, policy development is or should be a dynamic and lived process shaped by a combination of factors. So, for example, legal requirements, crisis management, global influences, societal needs and aspiration. This is where context and circumstances are very important. In an ideal policymaking process, so first policymakers identify key issues and craft potential solutions or options through thorough research and stakeholder consultations. Then they draft the policies, and this will undergo feedback from different stakeholders and leading to refinement that will address concern and will incorporate a suggestion. Following approval by relevant authorities, implementation plans are developed. So for these plans, you have the action, the timeline, the resource allocation, and the responsibilities. And then the policies are executed according to these plans. So this may involve legislative changes, administrative reform, or program initiative. You also need to monitor how the policies are implemented and how they are progressing for effectiveness. So you need to have periodic evaluation to assess impact and outcome, and to refine and enhance your policy, and also to address emerging challenges. So, and ultimately, policies may be terminated, replaced, or renewed. So based on insight from your monitoring exercises, and it can also be based on the evolving societal needs and policy objective. So this is a kind of iterative process, so that we always ensure that our policies are current, they are well informed, they are inclusive, they are responsive, and effective in addressing the societal challenges. However, in reality, policymaking can be quite different from the idealized process I describe. So policymaking is often influenced by political agenda, special interest group, media attention, and power struggles. So there are powerful stakeholders that are always involved in policymaking, and sometimes you have to align political interests of decision makers to those stakeholders. And also decision-making are highly political. And so you have compromises, you have delays, and you can make policies on emergency basis rather than scientific evidence. And then you have implementation challenges. And we always have to prioritize solutions sometimes that are not in line with the scientific evidence, but more because this will align with some kind of different agenda. So even when a policy is adopted, there is no, I would say, guarantee for successful implementation. There are a lot of challenges that are involved in the implementation of any policy. So you have resource constraint, you have bureaucratic hurdles, then there is lack of capacity and also a lot of resistance in some cases from stakeholders who are not involved in the policy-making process. So this is where we have to take a look at our processes and review how we're going to do that.
Dr. Motala-Tingle, how important is evidence-based science advisory in formulating policy?
I think it is a key point that we need to have evidence-based science advisory when we are formulating policy for several reasons. First, we in this way we ensure that policymakers they make informed decision. So that would be based on credible data, research finding, and expert analysis. And by relying on scientific evidence, I think that decision makers, policymakers, they can address complex challenges effectively. For example, we have a lot of challenges now. We have climate change. We have public health crisis. For example, we had COVID. We have to think about what are the new technological advancements that we want to see. And we have to remember that policymakers, government officials, politicians, most of the time, they have no scientific backgrounds and they rely on scientists and their evidence to help them in the process of making policies.
Dr. Uzma Alam highlights the importance of science in guiding policymaking.
It's at the center of it, right? We cannot assume that we'd have a good policy if it's not driven by scientific evidence, right? And the reason I say this is because, if we think about what is policy meant to do, right? So policy is an instrument, it's a tool that's meant to guide us in certain situations, and it's a way of, decision making. It's, a way of saying, this is the best option for problem A or B, right? So if we don't have the information to decide or to, systematically think through and say, this is how we arrive to the best solution, right? The policy or, whatever we are suggesting will definitely fail. Okay, but if we do it with the other way around where we say, okay, this is the evidence, this is the context, what does this tell us? Let's analyze it. What does this mean for our, our country or our society or our community? And based on that, if we say, okay, this is the information, based on this information, these are the best options, then we're obviously more likely to see positive, uptake of the policy recommendations, because obviously policy recommendations are there for, to guide different societies and different people. So you need to have that uptake, but you also need to have it implemented. And, in COVID, we saw a lot of this where we just without evidence. And, COVID obviously was a different case. It was a pandemic. It was something new. We were all learning about it, where we just blanketly just borrowed and said, to prevent COVID, we need to do social distancing, right? But in the African context, scientifically it made sense, but in the African context, that did not make sense because, a lot of our populations live in densely populated areas where social distancing wouldn't even be possible. So it was a policy, but because it wasn't contextualized and not driven by, African-led data or African, contextualized data, it just meant that we set ourselves up for failure. That's just one example. So there is this piece of not only uptake, but also implementation. So for implementation, and we can speak about this in detail later. So implement a good policy would also require that, it's implementable in our settings. So for example, we can have, so AI is a great one. And that's something we've been working on, right? AI is like the hot topic. It's a, buzzword in some ways, but we also know, what sort of impact it has. And then we know the expenses of how labor and resource intensive AI can be. So, if we go set a policy that says, and just borrow policy from the West, that can afford some of these high-end technologies, then we fail at implementation because we won't even get started. We won't be able to do what we've set out to do.
One of the areas in need of science advice input is policies surrounding climate change. Adeline Sayuzuzo, an environmentalist at the Green Protector, discusses the importance of science advice in climate change policies.
When we are talking about addressing climate change, when evidence-based science comes in, it comes with giving us solutions. The science gives us the scenario, the causes, and then the impacts. In this case, we are talking about climate change, and science have been telling us since, I don't remember when, maybe even before I was born, that if there will be climate change and what will be the impact. And now it has provided us with solution. So now I think what is actually remaining, it's up to us to actually put in action those solutions. So in few words, I would say that when it comes to evidence-based science, it gives us solution on how to tackle the climate change, solution that can actually even work, not just what the solution we think based on our own interest or how we feel about the climate change.
Dr. Shahin shares examples of areas that have successfully incorporated science advisory.
One example that I would take is one white paper on science, technology, and innovation that was adopted by the South African government in 2019. So that was shortly after the advent of democracy. So this policy demonstrated that the South African government is committed to using science, technology, and innovation to develop the country and to overcome the legacy of apartheid. So I think that policy making should always take into consideration the background of the country, the political reality, the social and economic reality. And reviews also have shown that the South African National System of Innovation, they have made significant progress now. And that, for instance, we have a lot more participation of Black people, women in research and development has increased, and the number of publications in science has grown in South Africa. So this is one of the examples, I would say, that is of a successful science policy. We also have the example of Rwanda. It has implemented ambitious science and technology policies, and they have what we call the science, technology, and innovation policy, which is the driving force to support the economic growth of the country. And it addresses national development priorities, which are healthcare, agriculture, renewable energy. So these are the type of policies that are made to drive an economy forward in the African continent. And then there is, of course, Nigeria, which is a country that has been investing a lot in science and policy development. And and which has invested also a lot on in science and technology over the years, because this is kind of recognition of the role of science and technology in socio-economic advancement. And but I think that there is still a lot of progress to be made. And there's still a lot of inequalities to be addressed when it comes to research and innovation in Africa. And although our government are focusing on the development of research and innovation through enabling policies, Africa still contributes very little to the world research output and to technology development. But we should, however, not forget the circumstances that lead to the situation that we are currently in. We should not forget, for instance, colonial history. We should not forget ongoing resource exploitation by foreign entities. There is also brain drain that we need to address. And there are a lot of man-made conflicts and wars in Africa, which, they continue to slow economic growth. And this is the reality in the African continent. There is a lot of very good things going on in Africa, and we need to focus on these. And I think that working together is one of the way that we have as policymakers and scientists to overcome our challenges and to look forward for more opportunities for growth and for collaboration.
Given the benefits it can bring, why is science advice not always incorporated in policy making? Dr. Uzma spoke to us about the challenges faced in incorporating science advice in policy making.
Let's look at that from the African context, right? And then globally, there are similar patterns, right? But Africa is very unique in a few ways when it comes to policy advice and science policy, right? So yes, there are issues with finding, some of this data, and some of that, unfortunately, is a systems level issue, right? So when we look at where scientific data is found, it's usually in journal articles, right? But if you look at these journals, there has been a systematic bias to leave out, authors and publications from Africa for multiple reasons, right? One is a cost of affordability. Two is just, inherent biases. Three, the system is skewed, so it's not just African scientists, also the issues around who publishes and who doesn't, if we're looking at gender or what topics are published. So, for example, a lot of the neglected tropical diseases are very important to the African landscape, but they're not, necessarily deemed important in the West, where a lot of these journals sit and publish from. So, that set of information will be left out. So there is this systematic bias that even when the data exists, it does not represent our context. And like I said, I gave you that previous example, context makes all the difference if a policy is going to work or not work, and if it's going to be, benefit the people. Remember, a policy can also disfranchise people. And that's a critical piece to keep in mind, right? When we think of policy, it's not always positive impact. There's a large danger of it also, negatively impacting whatever we're trying to do. So that's one piece of the puzzle, right? This lack of data in the published space, right? And then, again, linked to that is a lot of our research funding. This is, again, driven by, non-African driven. So, the research priorities are not necessarily our priorities. The data that comes out of does not really speak to our issue. That's another systematic level, right? And then if we go a level, if then we go from the global to slightly lower, and we look at regional and nationals, then what the issue is. So within our context, right, and this is how Africa is different, there are lots of different data points, right? So it is the scientific evidence, but remember that we also have a lot of local knowledge, so endogenous knowledge. You know this, right? Our communities have ways of treating X, Y, Z. Our communities are very innovative. Our communities have a certain way of lifestyle, right? So there's this big block of information that is missing usually, right? And that is again, that's something we are trying to work to slowly start changing and saying that, yes, there's one piece of data, but in our context, data is much broader. So how do we bring, for example, the arts into it, or how do we bring the African languages, or how do we bring local knowledge? And, there are lots of examples of what this means in pandemic preparedness, right? We can talk about, for example, Ebola, when we looked at Sierra Leone's case, and I'd responded, right? I was on the ground at that time, and I'd worked in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And, we had all the policies and we were implementing everything, but to be very honest, and now this is published, right? But at that time, it was something, it was like a hard pill to swallow for a lot of us, right? When there was this whole thing of, social distancing or, isolating people with Ebola, in the communities that was already happening, because in community homesteads, they already had these spaces built in. For example, some communities, had women isolated, when they were menstruating, or that kids isolate when they had chickenpox. So they were already aware of this, and they were actually already doing it. And that was what was effective, right? So that goes to talk to this enhancing, whatever our data is, with this really important local knowledge and contextualization, right? And then the third piece where data, right? So there's the published data, then there's this, non-gray matter, or what people call gray literature, which is another gap. But then the other gap is like within our African member states, right? So all our 55 Africa Union member states. And, I work with a few of them. So I'm advisory to, for Malawi, for example, on the science, technology, innovation policy. I've supported Nigeria on theirs. I've worked with Africa CDC on thinking through some of these policies. I've been part of the Africa Union Science, Technology and Innovation 2024 review. So, even speaking at that country level or the Africa Union level, it's very interesting of how some of our past has influenced how we make decisions and how that plays into politics, right? So some countries will have a space for science to interact with policymakers, but majority won't. And unfortunately, in Africa, even when we create this space because it's important, right? The ones who are making the policies are not necessarily the one generating the data or understanding it, and vice versa, right? The ones generating the data really might not be understanding, the policy implications of what it means. So it's really critical. That's another gap, right? That's another difficulty in how do we set up these structures that are more constant and not ad hoc. And there are examples of it coming up, and some governments are doing really well at it. But it's something that Africa really needs to not start thinking through. So Africa's always thought about it, especially when it comes to disease outbreaks, because we have the most disease outbreaks. Anytime there's a disease outbreak, there's always a mechanism of bringing scientists and policymakers into, Ministry of Health departments. But how to sustain that? I think that's a critical question. And then again, obviously, that is linked to, politics, willpower, and system-level thinking. And obviously, how do we finance that?
Dr. Mlungisi Sele, Chief Executive Officer of the National Advisory Council on Innovation in South Africa, highlights the need for collaboration between scientists and policymakers.
The literature does tell us that that relationship between scientists and policymakers is difficult, it's complex, it's not any easy. Even developed countries, they do acknowledge that especially institutions such as ours, NECI, you have to do a lot more than scientists and policymakers to be invited to sit at the table with policymakers. We are fortunate here in South Africa that there is a history of collaboration between scientists and policymakers in the sector, STI sector, or what we call the National System of Innovation. And then we're also fortunate that the heads of government, of the Department of Science and Innovation, since inception, are scientists themselves. You see, so they came from the scientific community and they maintain links with scientific community. You see, so that on its own. And then the composition of senior leaders, policymakers, were drawn from the scientific community. To an extent, there is that positive relationship. But of course, the two institutions have their own cultures which clash, as it's because the priorities and the pressures are different, right? Because irrespective of this positive historical background, at the end of the day, government has to deliver certain priorities within certain constraints. Sometimes scientists differ with such options, or scientists would offer options that policymakers will not. Okay, so you want me to give you a concrete example? Let's deal with the issue of renewables or the alternative energy to fossil fuels. It has not been always recognized or appreciated that we needed to diversify, even though in terms of policy, there's always been, parts. Here, it has taken a lot more or longer to get to a stage where we are. Maybe we needed a crisis, to force all parties to recognize. But in as much as, for instance, government set aside some research funding into alternative energies, but it has not been as much as we would have liked. Okay? And then what scientists had offered, which came, for instance, through our own entity, NEC, some advice that were different to the dominant energy options, were not always appreciated, by policymakers. Because whether for timing purpose or they were politically sensitive, they were raising politically sensitive questions. So there were those instances where the relationship, while cordial, but was not always, appreciated mutually. So just to illustrate, we do have advice that we have provided, which hadn't been utilized, you see. So if you want to use that as an illustration of this tension between policymakers and scientists, I'll offer that as a consideration, because sometimes scientists will say, this is what we think should be done. Policymakers will say, no, will not. And then years later, they have not had we listened. So I'm sorry, I might have taken the long route, but I'm saying here, yes, we do have a long-standing relationship, a positive one, because these two communities, at least in South Africa, they tend to collaborate. But there are moments of tensions and dispute, fist contest. And a clear illustration of this are the sorts of advice that scientific community provided to policymakers, which weren't considered, nor accepted, or appreciated, So, and thus it remains so. So it's complementary and contradictory.
That's all from us at Africa Science Focus today. If you want to find out more, head to the SciDevNet website. That's www.scidev.net. Today's show was produced by Alice Hurst, with editing by Titi Lokpe-Fadare and Ogechi Ekianyao, and reporting by Michael Kaluki. I'm Ogechi Ekianyao. Until next time, it's goodbye. This podcast was supported by the Science Granting Council Initiative, which aims to strengthen the institutional capacities of 18 public science funding agencies in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa Science Focus is produced by SciDevNet and distributed in association with your local radio station.